In the vast and unforgiving expanse of Egypt's western desert, amid the dunes and salt flats, lies one of antiquity's greatest unsolved mysteries. Around 524 BCE, an entire army, 50,000 strong, vanished. These weren't bandits or a wandering tribe. According to ancient sources, this was a Persian military force under King Cambyses II, sent to conquer the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis. The objective was clear: punish the priests who defied Persian authority and cement imperial power in the far reaches of the Egyptian frontier. The outcome, however, was nothing short of mythic. The army never returned. This wasn't merely a tactical blunder or poor navigation. Herodotus, the famed Greek historian writing a century later, claimed the force was swallowed by a sandstorm so massive it buried every man alive. No weapons, no bones, no armor were ever officially recovered. Just silence. For centuries, historians and archaeologists debated whether the story was real, allegorical, or some hybrid of both. After all, how could such a large force vanish completely? The western desert, stretching from the Nile to Libya, is not just desolate, it's treacherous. Sweltering days, freezing nights, and an almost total lack of landmarks make travel a calculated risk. Even modern expeditions struggle with orientation and survival. So how did an organized imperial army equipped with engineers, scouts, and supplies manage to disappear into thin air? To answer that, we must begin not with the desert, but with Cambyses II, the Persian king whose ambitions may have led 50,000 men into oblivion. Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, inherited more than just an empire. He inherited expectations. When he took the throne of the Achaemenid Empire in 530 BCE, the Persian realm stretched from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. But one region remained both symbolically and strategically tempting: Egypt. In 525 BCE, Cambyses launched his invasion of Egypt and succeeded. He captured the pharaoh Psamtik III and brought the rich kingdom under Persian rule. Yet, his reign over Egypt was marked by tension and cultural conflict. Cambyses, by many accounts, was erratic. Herodotus painted him as a madman, a ruler who desecrated Egyptian temples, mocked local deities, and ruled with paranoia. While this portrayal may reflect Greek bias, it's clear that Cambyses struggled to consolidate power over Egypt's deeply religious and independent-minded society. This friction culminated in his fixation with the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, a holy site held in near-mythical regard by Egyptians. The oracle had, according to legend, refused to recognize his authority, perhaps even declared him illegitimate. Whether out of vengeance or strategic impulse, Cambyses sent an army westward from Thebes, likely along the caravan routes through the oases, Karga, Dakhla, Farafra, and then to Siwa. The army was no ragtag unit. Estimates say 50,000 soldiers, likely including infantry, cavalry, engineers, and supply units, marched across the desert. They were Persians, Egyptians loyal to Cambyses, and possibly mercenaries. And yet, they vanished. This was not just a military failure, it was a metaphysical affront. How could a king who ruled the Nile fail to dominate the desert? And so, the story of a vanished army became a tale soaked in symbolism, wrapped in divine wrath, and frozen in sand. Our primary ancient source on this event is Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. He recounts the tale with vivid drama. Cambyses II, enraged at the Oracle of Amun, dispatches 50,000 men from Thebes. After 7 days of travel, the army reaches the oasis of Karga, where they resupply. Then, as they head deeper into the desert toward Siwa, disaster strikes. According to Herodotus, a great and violent wind arose, burying them beneath a mass of sand. Every soldier, every camel, spear, helmet, and tent was consumed by the storm. The sands reclaimed them without a trace. To modern ears, the story sounds fantastical. Could a single sandstorm annihilate 50,000 troops? Geologists argue that while sandstorms are common in the Sahara, they don't behave like avalanches or tsunamis. They scour, blind, choke, but they don't bury entire armies alive in neat layers. But Herodotus wasn't necessarily writing as a modern journalist. His histories often mingled myth and reality, using symbolic storytelling to reflect moral or cultural truths. A sandstorm devouring an army could represent divine punishment, an Egyptian desert defending its sacred oracle against a blasphemous invader. There's also the question of propaganda. Herodotus, a Greek, had little reason to lionize Persian kings. Painting Cambyses as reckless, impious, and ultimately punished by the gods would have served both Greek political agendas and local Egyptian narratives. Still, Herodotus was known to cite sources and witness testimony. His accounts of Egyptian geography and ritual are often surprisingly accurate. So we're left with an ambiguous document, one that may contain kernels of truth embedded in metaphor. Was there an army? Almost certainly. Did it vanish? Quite possibly. But was it sand, sabotage, or simply a massacre by another force that wiped them from history? To explore that, we need to understand the desert, not just as terrain, but as a character in its own right. The Egyptian Western Desert is not empty. It's hostile. From the Qattara Depression to the Great Sand Sea, it's a place where nature is not indifferent, but actively lethal. The region between the Nile and Siwa is a maze of limestone plateaus, salt pans, and sandy plains where temperatures can soar above 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, by day and plummet at night. In ancient times, crossing this region was not routine. Caravan routes existed. Traders moved between oases transporting dates, salt, and textiles, but even these journeys were limited to seasoned desert travelers who understood how to read stars, ration water, and sense sandstorm shifts by subtle cues in wind and pressure. A 50,000-man army would need an enormous logistical operation to survive. Food, water, fodder, pack animals, maps, scouts. It would have required months of planning and coordination, and even then, it would have been vulnerable. One miscalculation in timing, one lost water source, or one sudden Khamsin, hot wind, could trigger a domino effect of dehydration, heat stroke, and confusion. The Siwa route itself was particularly treacherous. There were no rivers, few landmarks, and limited water sources. The caravan path from Karga to Siwa required knowledge of shallow wells and seasonal springs. If a guide led the wrong way, or if a natural spring dried unexpectedly, the army could spiral into chaos within a day or two. And then there are the sandstorms, or haboobs. These are not just dusty gusts. They're towering walls of sand hundreds of feet tall, moving at high speed. Visibility drops to zero, and disorientation is instant. Imagine a unit of thousands caught mid-march, blinded, separated, and unable to locate water or one another. In such a scenario, death wouldn't come from the storm itself, but from the aftermath. Thirst, confusion, and exposure would eliminate an army not in a single moment, but over hours or days, leaving little behind except scattered bones, eventually buried by shifting dunes. One alternate theory proposed by some scholars is that the Persian army didn't succumb to natural forces at all, but to human ones. The Western Desert, though remote, was not uninhabited. Nomadic groups, Berber tribes, and oasis dwellers moved along known routes and had intimate knowledge of the terrain. If a massive, foreign military force was marching towards Siwa, a revered religious site, it may have been met with hostility, not just sandstorms. The oracle of a moon at Siwa held a powerful spiritual role. Even Alexander the Great, a century and a half later, made the arduous journey to receive its blessing. For Cambyses to attack or desecrate the site would have been an act of war not just against Egypt, but against divine legitimacy itself. Local groups, possibly aided by Siwan priests or even defected Egyptian scouts, may have organized a guerrilla-style ambush. In this version of events, the Persian army, already weakened by the desert march, would have been attacked by smaller mobile forces using the dunes and cliffs for cover. A full massacre could have occurred over several days. Wounded soldiers fleeing in every direction would have scattered without direction or support, making it nearly impossible for later search parties to reconstruct what happened. What supports this idea is that no contemporary Persian sources mention the army's fate. This conspicuous silence could suggest that the story was intentionally buried, quite literally and figuratively, to avoid admitting that a supposedly invincible Achaemenid force had been decimated by a band of desert dwellers. If true, this theory paints the vanished army not as victims of nature, but as casualties of regional resistance. In this light, the desert becomes less of a killer and more of a weapon wielded by people who knew it intimately, a reminder that imperial arrogance in unfamiliar territory often breeds disaster. What if there was no storm, no ambush, no act of divine punishment? What if the cause of disappearance was more mundane, more human, and ultimately more tragic? Consider the logistics of moving 50,000 troops across one of the world's harshest terrains. The army's survival would have hinged on a fragile chain of command, detailed mapping, and trust in guides who knew the route. A single miscommunication, or worse, a rebellion among the guides, could doom the entire operation. There's a theory that the Egyptian guides, possibly resentful of Persian overlordship, intentionally led the army astray. A minor detour could shift a caravan off course by miles in the desert. Without reliable water sources or orientation markers, the soldiers could have wandered aimlessly, watching their supplies dwindle and their ranks thin. Under such conditions, discipline breaks down, factions splinter, mutinies occur. Even the numbers warrant scrutiny. While Herodotus claims 50,000 men, that figure could be inflated or misrecorded. A smaller army would have been even more vulnerable. If the force began disintegrating after a week without water or bearings, then it wouldn't take a supernatural event to explain their disappearance. Just desperation, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Such an explanation is far less romantic than a sandstorm or a holy curse, but it's also more probable. History is full of logistical catastrophes. Napoleon's march into Russia, the British at Gallipoli, or even more recent military blunders involving terrain. In these cases, it wasn't enemy fire that brought armies low. It was bad planning, worse luck, and the hubris of men who underestimated nature. To understand why Cambyses II may have risked an entire army in this campaign, we need to grasp the spiritual and political weight of the Oracle of Amun at Siwa. Located hundreds of miles west of the Nile, in an oasis surrounded by dunes and jagged rock, the temple at Siwa was a place of divine authority, its priests believed to speak for the god Amun, one of ancient Egypt's most powerful deities. Kings, pharaohs, and generals alike journeyed to Siwa seeking guidance, legitimacy, or absolution. When Cambyses conquered Egypt, he attempted to co-opt its traditions, declaring himself pharaoh in the ancient style. But the Siwan priests reportedly refused to recognize his rule, perhaps declaring that he lacked the divine right to govern the land. In the highly ritualized world of Egyptian kingship, such a slight wasn't just religious defiance, it was a political liability. By refusing him their blessing, the oracle undermined Cambyses' grip over the newly conquered province. This wasn't simply a snub, it was a challenge to the cosmic order. That could explain why Cambyses would send such a large force across a dangerous terrain. The campaign wasn't just a punitive expedition, it was a message. Destroying the oracle would signal that Persian rule extended even to the gods of Egypt. Submitting Siwa would mean complete domination, both spiritual and territorial. But if the army never reached it, or worse, was destroyed on the way, then the oracle's power would grow. And indeed, it did. A century later, Alexander the Great himself made the pilgrimage to Siwa, not to destroy it, but to seek its affirmation. The priests declared him the son of Amun, a divine endorsement that shaped his self-image and his empire. That Cambyses attempted the opposite and failed adds a layer of cosmic irony to the story. One king defied the oracle and lost an army. Another bowed before it and gained a legacy. For centuries, the fate of Cambyses' army remained speculative. No bones, no weapons, no campsites. Nothing tangible had emerged from the desert sands. But in the early 2000s, whispers of a discovery reignited global interest in the mystery. Two Italian researchers, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, claim to have found remnants of the lost army in the Great Sand Sea, near the border of Egypt and Libya. Their findings included bronze weapons, arrowheads, fragments of Persian-style ceramics, and even human bones, all scattered near what appeared to be an ancient caravan route. They presented their case in a documentary, proposing that they had uncovered the path the army took and the site where it ultimately perished. The hypothesis was that a powerful sandstorm caught the troops mid-march, forcing them to hunker down. Overwhelmed by wind and lacking water, the army succumbed, their remains gradually buried under layers of sand. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, however, greeted the findings cautiously. Some experts questioned the dating of the artifacts and whether the site could definitively be linked to Cambyses' army. Critics noted that desert scavengers, looters, and shifting dunes could easily misplace or mix artifacts from different eras. Still, the discovery reignited scholarly and public curiosity. While not confirmed, the site remains the closest physical evidence yet found that aligns with Herodotus' description. Excavations have continued in the region, but the sheer size of the Western Desert and the delicate politics of cross-border digs make progress slow. So, has the army truly been found? Not definitively, but the sands are beginning to whisper their secrets, one broken arrowhead at a time. Despite new archaeological leads and enduring folklore, many historians and scientists remain divided on one essential question: did the army even exist in the first place? To begin with, there are no surviving Persian records about this particular campaign. That doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. Persian archives from Cambyses' reign are sparse overall, but it does leave us reliant almost exclusively on Herodotus, who, as previously noted, was writing a century later and had clear cultural and political biases. It's worth noting that Herodotus had a flair for dramatics. His works often balance between fact and fable. He famously wrote about dog-headed men in Libya and gold-digging ants in India. So is the disappearing army just another moralistic myth wrapped in historical names? Some scholars believe the whole story may have been an exaggerated explanation for a failed or incomplete expedition. Cambyses might have sent a detachment towards Siwa, but not a full-scale 50,000-man force. That number itself may have been symbolic, representing a massive loss more than a literal head count. Perhaps a much smaller unit went missing, say 5,000, and the legend ballooned over time. This idea aligns with how oral tradition can inflate real events. In a pre-modern context, where writing was rare and storytelling was dominant, a disastrous expedition could easily morph into a tale of total annihilation, reinforced by nationalist, religious, or cultural motivations. For Egyptians and later Greeks, the story of a sacrilegious foreign army being wiped out by the gods of the desert was too satisfying to pass up. From this viewpoint, the tale isn't meaningless. It's a cultural artifact in itself. It reveals how ancient peoples perceived empire, divine justice, and geography. Whether or not 50,000 men were lost beneath the sands, the story endures because it resonated with the people who passed it down. It became a symbol of imperial arrogance and the invisible boundary between the known world and the mysterious beyond. In many ways, the story of Cambyses' vanished army is less about history and more about how history becomes legend. The Western Desert stands not just as a geographical location, but as a frontier of imagination, a place where the rules of civilization fall away and nature, or the gods, reclaim authority. For the Egyptians, the story affirmed the spiritual power of the Siwa oracle and the wrath of Amun. For the Greeks, it served as a cautionary tale of Persian hubris, an example of how even the mightiest empires could be undone by divine retribution or natural chaos. For modern audiences, it embodies the allure of the unsolved, the romantic pull of ancient mysteries that seem just on the edge of being cracked open. Cambyses II himself remains a tragic figure in history. After failing to conquer Ethiopia and potentially losing an entire division in the desert, he returned to Persia under a dark cloud. He died shortly afterward under mysterious circumstances, some say from infection, others from suicide or assassination. His legacy is overshadowed by his more successful relatives, but the story of his army lives on, passed down in whispered accounts, speculative documentaries, and buried arrowheads. Perhaps the greatest legacy of this vanished army is how it blurs the line between myth and memory. It challenges us to think critically about our sources, to question what's possible in a time before GPS and satellite imaging, and to respect the sheer power of environmental storytelling. A sandstorm may not seem legendary to a modern eye, but in the ancient world, it could erase an army, a king's ambition, and even historical certainty. The desert keeps its secrets well. Whether buried by wind or by time, the fate of Cambyses's army remains one of the greatest historical puzzles still blowing across the dunes.